Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be giving you some recommendations that fall into the category of literary fantasy. I'm not going to get too bogged down in the definition of what I classify as literary fantasy. To me, literary fantasy is books that are just essentially really beautifully written. They're almost quite lyrical, quite poetic, and there is a, almost dreamy nature to them in a way. Again, let's not get too bogged down into the definition of literary fantasy. I think we all can probably name one or two books as it relates to literary fantasy. I do have a couple of recommendations to give and I love every single one of these books and or series. So with that in mind, let's jump into the first recommendation. So the first recommendation that I still haven't done my review of, and I think I know why, and I'll talk about that a little bit when I do actually film my review, because I have actually planned the video now. I just need to sit down and film it, but I think it's going to be a bit of a lengthier review than I typically do. But the thing about Book of the New Sun that I really love is just how it completely transports you to the world that we're in. And it just feels like you are going on this journey with our main character, Severian, and we're just on this ride as he basically figures out kind of who he is and what role he plays in this broader world. And that's all I'm really going to say as it goes to the plot. I think with a lot of literary fiction, I think it's best just to go into these books and kind of just go along with the ride rather than reading too much around the plot. But there's something really, really special about Book of the New Sun. There's something really special about Book of the New Sun, and I think it's because Gene Wolfe was a lover of literature himself, and you can really see that echoed throughout the 4 volumes. And it really, like when I finish reading the final book, and even throughout my entire journey of reading the 4 volumes, I just felt like this is a book for people who love reading, because I think Wolfe really embeds other works into his work that if you don't necessarily have to know what they are, but I think if you do know what they are and kind of what he's referencing, it really enriches the broader world. There are layers upon layers upon layers in Book of the New Sun. It's one of those books that every single time you read it, you're going to take something new from it. It's similar to other authors that I've read, like Baker. I suspect Malazan by Stephen Eckerson is similar. This isn't the sort of series that you just read it and that's it. No, like you have to kind of keep reading it to really grasp the magnitude of this world and how beautifully Gene Wolfe paints it as well. And to give you an indication as to how beautiful this writing is, and I'm going to do this for every single book that I recommend, I am going to read a short passage from, I think it is volume 1. So here it is. And it came to me that these trees had been hardly smaller when I was yet unborn, and had stood as they stood now when I was a child playing among the cypresses and peaceful tombs of our necropolis, and that they would stand yet, drinking in the last light of the dying sun, even as now, when I had been dead as long as those who rested there. Oh, just listen to that. It's just incredible. All right, we'll move on to the next one. So the next book that I'm going to recommend is A Stranger in Olondria by Sophia Samatar. Now, this is just one of the most underrated fantasy books ever written. Like, barely anybody just talks about it. More people need to read it. Sophia Samatar just is incredible. Like, she just has the most beautiful way with words. And in A Stranger of Olondria, we're basically following our main character, Jevik, as he goes to this amazing place called Olondria. It's kind of where the heart of trade is, the heart of art. It's kind of like a center of commerce. I think it's the sort of place that most people would want to live in. Like, it's very beautiful as well. And there's a real sense of appreciation for the arts and culture and science and all of those things. It is just absolutely wonderful. Like, it really is. And it's a very unusual book. I don't think it's going to be a book for a lot of people because, like, not a lot actually happens. Like, there are things that happen, but really the reason why you read this type of book, and I would argue the same for a lot of the books on this list, is because you just want to be swept away on this journey that you're going on with this character or these characters, and you're just kind of there for the ride. There is a sumptuousness to the world, there is a poetic nature to Samatar's writing, and our main character, Jevik, I think is a very relatable character. He is just a normal guy and he wants to experience a part of the world because of all of the stories that he's heard about it. And similar to the first recommendation that I gave, I think, again, there's kind of stories within stories within stories. It's very multi-layered, it's very nuanced. And I feel like this is one of those books that you have to read multiple times to really appreciate the beauty of it. As for the quote that I picked for this one, once you've built something that takes all your passion and will, it becomes more precious to you than your own happiness. You don't realise that while you are building it, that you are creating a martyrdom, something which later will make you suffer. I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. All right, next recommendation. We have China Mountain Zhang by Maureen McHugh. Now, this is technically sci-fi, but I'm going to lump it into this list because I think if you like fantasy, you will absolutely love this book. And again, very underrated. Nobody talks about it. It's not a new sci-fi book by any means. I think it was written in the 90s, but again, it's one of those books that is incredibly multi-layered, it's incredibly rich, and we really get a sense of our main character and also the secondary cast characters by the end of the book. This is also a very short book. It's a very quick read. I read it in an afternoon because it just sucks you in with the absolutely stunning writing. With China Mountain Zhang, we follow our main character Zhang as he basically goes throughout different periods of his life. He starts off as a young man and he has, not the greatest job in the world, but he wants to basically retrain to be a scientist. And as he goes through that process, more and more opportunities open up to him. And the funny thing is about this book is that my summary barely scrapes the surface of this book because there's so many different themes explored. Through every single secondary character, we explore like a very specific theme. So I'll give you one example. One of the side characters, I won't say who because I don't want to spoil it, but one of the side characters, there's a whole exploration around like beauty standards, and I just wasn't expecting that in this book, and yet I appreciated it, and it's something that I still think about because I think McHugh handled the topic extremely sensitively and did it in a way that doesn't isolate a certain perspective or doesn't try to attack a certain perspective. And I really, really appreciate that when it is a topic that requires, a decent amount of discussion and does contain a lot of nuance within it. And books like this, and I don't mean just China Mountain Zhang, I mean all the books on this list, like I think they all do a really good job of like posing certain philosophical and moral questions. And I think in particular, you get that in China Mountain Zhang because most of the characters are so unapologetically themselves that you're forced to confront certain beliefs that you may have. And that's what I love about this book. It's a book that I will reread, again and again and again because the themes that it covers are timeless, and we're going to still be discussing these things probably in 100 years, 1,000 years if the world is still around then. And it's just an absolute delight because I think she does it in a way that is unapologetic, but also very sensitively. The other thing that I really like about this book, as I kind of mentioned in my very brief plot summary, is that we do really see our main character develop from the start of the book all the way up until the end. It's a pretty short book, as I mentioned. So the fact that she's able to write such detailed character growth in such a small amount of time is astonishing. Like I don't know how she did it. I need to reread it and reread it and reread it and study it to really understand like how she managed to do it. But she's able to not only flesh out our main character so that by the end of it we become really attached to him, but we also, through the secondary characters, we become really attached to them even though we don't spend that much time with them. So it's just a masterclass in character development. It's a masterclass in writing really beautiful prose while not distracting from the story and from the characters' individual journeys. And it also poses some really interesting moral and philosophical questions as it relates to things like colonialism, culture, technology, and how all of those different things play out in our lives. Here's the quote that I picked. "We enter all major relationships with no real clue of where we are going. Marriage, birth, friendship. We carry maps we believe are true. Our parents' relationship, what it says in the baby books, the landscape of our own childhood. These maps are approximate at best, dangerously misleading at worst." There's so many amazing quotes from that book. I could genuinely read probably 100 and still not do justice to it. Next, we have a book that I've talked a lot about on my channel, and I think rightly so has gained quite a lot of attention in the last year in particular, and that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. Now, The Spear Cuts Through Water is just one of the most wonderful fantasy books I've ever read. Again, similar to Book of the New Sun, it's stories within stories within stories. There are literally like 3 layers to this book, and it is again astonishing how Simon Jimenez is able to pack so much into one book. It's quite a big book, but I wouldn't say it's the chunkiest book in the world. I think it's about 400 or 500 pages, which is pretty average for fantasy. But the fact that he's able to literally to have like 3 layers to this story and do all 3 layers to this story justice is remarkable. Like I've not seen many authors do it well, and I've not seen many authors in particular do it to this high quality. Like it is just, you know, like similar to Maureen McHugh's book, like it should be studied. It's that remarkable. The Spear Cuts Through Water, for anyone who doesn't know, it's about 2 warriors who shepherd an ancient god across a very fractured land to essentially end the tyranny of this ruling family. And it's just every single character is fleshed out. There's quite a lot of characters in this book, and you don't really realise it until you finish it and you reflect on it, because every single character is given due attention. The villains are some of the best villains I've ever read. They really feel like genuinely evil people that if we met them in our real everyday lives, we would probably be quite scared of them. And rightly so, because they are terrifying. Our main character, Kima, is just an absolute delight to read because I think he's very relatable. I don't think he feels like the typical hero who is just pure good. He's very multi-layered. He is definitely a shade of grey. And I think he's just a delight to be in his head, because I think he approaches the situations that he's in that I think a lot of normal people would. And that's always quite nice to have a character that feels aspirational, but also relatable at the same time. The interesting thing about this book is that it just feels like something completely unique. Like I've never read a book quite like it, not even the ones on this list. And yet there is a timeless quality to it that I don't see anybody else being able to write a story like this. I mean, obviously there will be at some point, but it's just so unique. And I think there is a real care and attention that is given to this world. I'd say that for all the books on this list, but you can really tell that the author has really thought out the story and has really given due attention to every single aspect of it, whether that's each of the characters, each of the layers within the story, the plot points, the world building, whatever it may be. Like you can really, really tell that he has thought through every single thing. And I personally don't think there's anything better than a really intentional author. I've read books in the past where you can tell the author is kind of just making it up as they go along. I think there is a time and a place for that at times. I think it's very rewarding to read an author who is really intentional, who is really thinking about every single detail, especially when there is a level of complexity in this world that I don't think we get in a lot of traditional fantasy books. For the quote that I picked, and again, this is another one where there's like a ton of quotes that I could have picked for this, but I'm just gonna go ahead with this one. "I've lived a long time," she said, "and the longer I live, the more it surprises me and saddens me how wise the young must become to live in this world." So good. Okay, so we're on to the last one, and this one is also sci-fi. I know I'm kind of cheating, but again, I think if you are a fantasy reader and lover, then you will also love this book. This author has also written fantasy books. I am curious if anybody has guessed it now, and that is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, this is a really quick read, and it was so ahead of its time, like so ahead of its time. It's actually quite creepy, like how ahead of its time it was. This is one of those books that if you kind of want to be a bit enlightened and you want to see the kind of circularity of life and history, then this is the sort of book that I would strongly recommend. In terms of what this book is about, we are essentially following our main character, George Orr, and he wakes up to discover that his dreams have the ability to alter reality. And it's important to specify that the time this world is set in is a very violent and dangerous time, and there's environmental catastrophes. You know, the world is very fractured, there's no sense of unity, and things are basically crumbling, right? Sound familiar? I do think this is a particularly good book to read now, because some of the things that are discussed in this book, like we're literally seeing happen now, but that's also why I think it's particularly good if you're interested in like the circularity of history, because this is also not the first time that the world has been fractured, right? And it's most definitely not going to be the last. So this book is really beautifully written. I would say of the 4 other books that I've recommended on this list, it's probably one of the harder ones to read, just because it does feel a little dense in places. It's a very short book. Again, you could read it in a couple of hours, but it is a little dense in places. When I read this book, I had to kind of divide it up, and I read something alongside it that was not as intense because it kind of helped me kind of get through it and kind of really dig deeper into the thematic work, which I'll come on to in a second. I would say it's very characteristic of a sci-fi book from the 70s. Like I think it's very clear that this was written back in the day, and I think it has certain traits that are very obviously from that period of time. I don't think it's necessarily like a really hard book to read. I just think go into it knowing that it's going to potentially be a little bit denser than some of the other books on this list. That being said, like the writing is beautiful and the thematic work is just excellent. Like it's so good. I think ultimately the main thing that I took from this book, and there's a whole bunch of things that I took from this book, and it's another book that I will definitely reread at some point, but the main thing that I took from it is that whenever you try to attempt to force people to do things that they don't want to do, and you try to enforce a certain level of like power over them, then eventually it's going to lead to a disastrous, corrupt outcome. And I think we've seen that throughout the entire history of humanity, right? I don't think that's a new idea. But I think she tackles it in a way that is just like, this book is so laser sharp focused around that point that by the end of it, you kind of think about how our own like political systems, social systems, cultural norms are set up, and how in a way we're almost taught to be constantly against each other. And that's to the benefit of the people who are trying to exert power. It's a really, really interesting concept. Naturally, with a book that is about kind of changing reality and altering events, there's a lot of discussion around like the nature of reality and what it means to change past events to influence future events, what impact that has not only on the individual who is making that change, but then also the broader world around it, and the second and third order effects that that can have that maybe the person who's doing that doesn't intend to make. It basically talks about like the limitations of knowledge, because there's that whole kind of thought exercise around like, if you could kill a fascist leader, the one in Germany as an example, as a baby, would you do it? I think most people would probably say yes. At the same time, there are second and third order effects that could happen. We don't know the consequences of those, right? And that's what I find really interesting around that debate is that, like, I think, again, like most people would say yes, but we can't possibly predict what's going to happen. If that happened, what's going to replace it? So it's just a really interesting discussion. It brings up, I think, your kind of own understanding of that topic, and it kind of puts you in an uncomfortable position to think about your own limitations. And I think it just puts you on the spot, which I always appreciate. And then the last bit that I would say that I really enjoyed, there's loads of thematic work explored in this book naturally, but I'm just going to pick out the bits that I particularly liked, which is this idea around like cosmic balance, and there always being some level of unexplainable balance in the world. And there is some exploration around like positivism, behaviorism. Taoism is a big influence in this book as well. And I don't know a ton about any of those things. I read a little bit about positivism and behaviorism when I was reading my degree at university. Never touched Taoism though. But there is this very interesting discussion around like, how do we live in harmony with the world? How do we live in harmony with each other? And how does that impact the broader universe? Like, it's very, very cool. Very interesting book. Like, again, I think this is one of those books that like should be studied in like political philosophy classes, because there's some really fascinating like predictions that Ursula K. Le Guin talks about like from a political lens in this book, that just like, how did she write about these things before they even happen? Again, it does go back to that circularity of history, and we always end up where we began. But I think it's just, there's particularly a few things that she picks up on that I just think is pretty crazy. I won't say what though, because I don't want to spoil it. It's just such an incredibly well-rounded book that talks about a lot of things in a decent amount of detail in such a short amount of time. Like, it's crazy. And then in terms of the quote that I picked, oh, there's so many quotes in this book. There's so many quotes in all of these books, but this is one that I've kind of kept in my mind. Things don't have purposes, as if the universe were a machine where every part has a useful function. What's the function of a galaxy? I don't know if our life has a purpose, and I don't see that it matters. What does matter is that we're a part, like a thread in a cloth or a glass blade in a field. It is, and we are. What we do is like wind blowing on the grass. So good. So good. And that's it. Those are 5 books that I would recommend if you like literary fiction or if you want to get into the genre. I definitely will do another video kind of telling you where to start if you're new to the genre, because a lot of these I wouldn't say are beginner friendly. I think a lot of these, if you're a bit more into your fantasy journey, you like philosophical fantasy, then I would definitely recommend picking these up. But watch this space. Definitely consider subscribing if you're not already subscribed, and I will definitely be doing a video on beginner literary fantasy books for you to read. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books. Let me know down below if there are any other literary fantasy books that you recommend, not only to myself, but to other people who are watching this video. I'm always up for taking recommendations. I have read a decent amount of literary fiction. This is just a couple that I wanted to call out, but without a doubt, there'll be future videos where I will also recommend some more. So there we have it. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, do consider subscribing. And I will see you in my next video, folks. And also down in the comments. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye.